Imagine the year 1860. The United States stretched from the familiar, bustling cities of the East Coast all the way to the gold-streaked shores of California, an empire of commerce and possibility. But for all its size, it was a land profoundly divided by distance, a separation so immense it threatened the very idea of a unified nation. If you were standing in the heart of New York City, the capital of American finance and news, and needed to communicate with a distant family member or business partner in San Francisco, the fastest reliable method was the stagecoach, a grueling, bone-jarring journey that took at least 3 weeks, often more depending on the weather, the trail conditions, and the ever-present dangers of the 2,000-mile overland route. The famous Pony Express, celebrated in legend, was faster, but still required at least 10 days of continuous, breakneck riding by a chain of young, dedicated men pushing themselves and their horses to the absolute limit. A thought, a crucial piece of news, or a vital business order could be a month out of date by the time it reached its destination. This communications gap was more than an inconvenience. It was an unbearable silence at the heart of the American dream, a logistical nightmare that hampered the war effort, stunted Western development, and created an environment ripe for speculation and misunderstanding. The problem, everyone knew, was the Great American Desert, a vast, formidable territory stretching from the Missouri River westward, encompassing the towering Rocky Mountains, the blistering deserts of Nevada and Utah, and the high plains, all unpopulated save for scattered military outposts, resilient Native American tribes, and the occasional brave settler. No infrastructure existed, no easy roads, and certainly no means to transmit electrical current across such an expanse. Yet, the dream was persistent and intoxicating. Instantaneous communication. The telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse and refined in the preceding decades, had already revolutionized the East. Short lines crisscrossed New England and the mid-Atlantic, allowing messages to fly between cities with the speed of light. Now, the goal was the transcontinental telegraph, a single, audacious line that would bridge the continent, connecting east to west, and effectively shrinking the vast territory to a whisper's distance. This was not merely a matter of technology, it was a matter of national destiny, a literal thread to bind the Union together, particularly as the rumblings of civil conflict grew louder. The stage was set by a group of determined, visionary men. In 1860, Congress, recognizing the urgency of the matter, passed the Telegraph Act, which authorized a subsidy of $40,000 a year for 10 years to the company that could successfully build and operate a transcontinental line. Two powerful entities immediately stepped up to the challenge. The Western Union Telegraph Company, which was already a dominant force in the East, and a relative newcomer in California, the Overland Telegraph Company, led by a savvy, persistent entrepreneur named Hiram Sibley. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. The Overland Telegraph Company would build the line eastward from California, and Western Union, through its subsidiary, the Pacific Telegraph Company, would build westward from Omaha, Nebraska. They would meet somewhere in the middle, likely in Utah. The race was on, but it was a race not against each other so much as against time, terrain, and the sheer brutal logistics of the task. The winner would be the company that could overcome the impossible obstacles of the route first. The initial preparations alone were staggering. For the section building westward from Omaha, led by Edward Creighton, the logistical genius of the operation, the first challenge was securing wood. Telegraph poles needed to be precisely cut, treated, and transported. While the plains of Nebraska were flat and offered a relatively clear line of sight, they were treeless. Every single pole, thousands upon thousands, had to be hauled hundreds of miles from the forests of eastern Nebraska and Iowa. Creighton hired hundreds of wagons, forming long, snaking trains pulled by oxen, each moving at a slow, deliberate pace. These wagons carried not only the poles, but also reels of iron wire, insulators, small fragile glass or ceramic pieces that kept the electric current from draining into the wet wood, and the essential tools, shovels, axes, and reels for paying out the wire. As the line pushed further west, past the 100th meridian, the logistics became even more complex. The team was entering territory with no established supply chain, hostile weather, and uncertain relations with the indigenous populations whose ancestral lands they were crossing. Consider the human effort involved. Building the line required 2 parallel crews, moving simultaneously. The pole-setting crew would go ahead, digging the holes, sinking the poles, and tamping the earth around them. Following closely behind would be the wire-stringing crew, who had the delicate and dangerous task of unspooling the heavy wire and hoisting it onto the insulators, ensuring the correct tension and minimal slack. Every mile meant setting approximately 25 to 30 poles, which translated into sinking and securing perhaps 60,000 to 75,000 poles across the entire 2,000-mile span. The men worked relentlessly, driven by the urgency of the mission and the promise of a substantial bonus for timely completion. Their days were a rhythmic cycle of physical labor under the blazing sun or freezing wind. The clang of the shovel hitting the prairie sod, the rhythmic creak of the pulley lifting the heavy wire, and the shouts of the foreman urging them onward. They slept under the open sky, their only protection the firelight and the presence of their fellow workers. Meanwhile, the Western crew, building eastward from California, faced an entirely different set of natural barriers. They did not struggle for wood in the same way as they initially moved through the timber-rich Sierra Nevada mountains. But this advantage was immediately offset by the extreme terrain. Hauling heavy equipment and wire through steep, narrow mountain passes, over granite outcroppings, and through deep snowpacks was an engineering marvel in itself. Once they cleared the Sierras, they encountered the vast, arid desolation of the Great Basin, modern-day Nevada and Utah, where water was scarce and the heat was oppressive. Here, the challenge shifted from managing excess wood to finding any suitable material for poles in a land of scrub brush and rock. They were often forced to haul poles backward, moving wood from the mountain regions into the desert, a reversal of the Eastern team's challenge. This environmental contrast highlighted the sheer magnitude of the task. A single line had to be engineered to survive the swamps of the east, the treeless plains, the arid deserts, and the snowy peaks of the west. The builders had to think not just of communication, but of survival for the line itself against the raw, unyielding forces of nature. The spirit of this endeavor was captured in the determination of men like Creighton, who had personally ridden the entire proposed route in the preceding months, surveying the landscape and making meticulous notes on supply points, water sources, and potential obstacles. He understood the territory in a way that boardroom engineers in the East could not, grasping the necessity of local sourcing and adaptability. The Native American tribes along the route posed another, more delicate challenge. Many saw the strange taut wire and the marching line of poles as an unwelcome intrusion, a literal line drawn across their hunting grounds and sacred lands. While some tribes offered cautious cooperation, others expressed open hostility. For the crews, maintaining peaceful relations was a daily necessity, often involving diplomacy, respect for boundaries, and sometimes the exchange of goods. The telegraph line was, in many ways, the physical embodiment of the relentless advance of the American frontier, a silent, vibrating chord announcing the end of an era of untouched wilderness. As the summer of 1861 wore on, the two ends of the line crept closer to the designated meeting point in Salt Lake City, Utah. The world watched, waiting for the moment when the last gap would be closed. The construction was moving at a pace far exceeding initial pessimistic predictions. Creighton's eastern crew, taking advantage of the relatively smooth plains, were logging impressive mileages, laying up to 7 or 8 miles of line in a good day. The western crew, though slowed by the mountains and the subsequent desert, maintained a steady, relentless advance. The promise of the connection began to breathe life into the small settlements along the route, creating temporary boom towns that sprang up to service the construction camps, providing food, water, and temporary housing. This enterprise was not just building a wire, it was laying the groundwork for a new economic and social geography for the West. The silent gap was closing, and with every mile of wire strung, the unbearable silence was giving way to the faint yet unstoppable hum of progress and connection. The dream, once a flicker in the minds of visionary engineers, was now a tangible reality, marching pole by pole across the vast, indifferent landscape. The stage was almost set for the final, astonishing moment of unification. As the year 1861 reached its midpoint, the construction of the transcontinental telegraph had transformed from a distant, ambitious scheme into a powerful, palpable reality. The work, especially on the Eastern Front, led by Edward Creighton, was a testament to sheer, sustained effort and meticulous planning. Creighton had established a highly efficient assembly line approach to the wilderness. His teams were divided into specialized units, the logistics corps managing the endless flow of supplies, the diggers who broke the often hardened prairie earth, the setters who raised and secured the heavy cedar or pine poles, and finally, the skilled linemen who strung the iron wire across the glass insulators. This systematic process allowed the Eastern Line, the Pacific Telegraph Company, to advance with astonishing speed, pushing past the Platte River and deep into the territory that would soon be known as Wyoming. They were not merely building a static line, they were creating a dynamic, moving frontier of communication, often outrunning their own supply lines and relying on the efficiency of their scouts to locate scarce water and grazing land for the thousands of oxen and mules that powered the endeavor. The material of this revolutionary connection was not copper, which was too expensive and brittle, but heavy iron wire manufactured back east and shipped by rail as far as the tracks went, which, at that time, was barely beyond the Missouri River. From there, the wire was transferred onto massive, slow-moving freight wagons. Each reel of wire was a significant load, and transporting enough to span hundreds of miles required huge trains of these wagons, often stretching for a mile across the prairie, a true spectacle of early American logistics. The men responsible for spooling the wire, the linemen, were the most skilled and highly paid of the crew. They had to ensure the wire was pulled taut enough to prevent excessive sagging, yet not so taut that it would snap in the freezing cold of a high-altitude winter. The characteristic hum of the newly strung wire, a faint, almost musical sound caused by the wind passing over the tensioned metal, became the first audible symbol of modern civilization penetrating the ancient silence of the plains. For those who had lived their whole lives hearing only the wind, the cry of a coyote, and the thunder of buffalo, this new metallic hum was an eerie, profound change. One of the greatest engineering feats lay in crossing the vast network of rivers and streams, especially the wide, powerful tributaries of the Missouri. Simply stringing the wire across would leave it vulnerable to floods, ice flows, and snags. The solution required constructing tall, robust river poles, often twice the height of the standard poles, set deep into the riverbanks. In some places, the linemen had to use small boats to ferry the massive coils across, then scramble up the high poles, sometimes over 60 feet tall, to secure the wire, all while fighting the current and the weight of the heavy cable. These river crossings were temporary points of intense, focused labor, often drawing the attention of curious travelers or Native American observers who watched in silence as these strangers battled the elements to lay down their invisible chain of thought. This struggle against the raw power of the land emphasized that the telegraph was a project not just of technology, but of human persistence against environmental obstacles that had defeated countless travelers before them. As the line advanced westward, it approached the area controlled by the Pony Express, the very service it was built to replace. The relationship between the two entities was both competitive and symbiotic. The Pony Express, operated by the stagecoach firm Russell, Majors and Waddell, was the existing communications lifeline, and its riders were keenly aware that the completion of the telegraph would mean the immediate obsolescence of their daring, romantic enterprise. Ironically, the Pony Express riders often served as the fastest means of transporting construction orders, payment, and emergency parts to the far-flung telegraph camps. For a brief, fleeting period, the two forms of communication, the horse-powered hero and the light-speed messenger, existed side by side, a perfect, beautiful contrast between the old frontier and the dawning technological age. The Pony Express managers even hoped that the telegraph's wire would break often, extending their profitable, if perilous, service. But the speed of the telegraph's construction made their future clear. The galloping horses would soon be silenced by the sound of an electrical pulse. Meanwhile, on the western side, the Overland Telegraph Company's crew, building eastward from Carson City, Nevada, faced their unique trial, the Great Basin Desert. After conquering the demanding climb and descent of the Sierra Nevadas, they entered a land of stark, treeless desolation. Here, the poles were the problem. Unlike the East, where wood was only distant, here it was practically non-existent. The crews had to resort to an incredible feat of logistical gymnastics, hauling poles cut in the California mountains backward, hundreds of miles across the desert floor. In some areas, they were forced to use smaller, fire-hardened native wood, or even construct makeshift stone and mud supports testing the limits of electrical insulation. Water, for both the men and the livestock, became the primary daily crisis. Every water source, however brackish, had to be carefully managed and guarded. The heat was relentless, causing the iron wire to expand and sag during the day and contract sharply at night, requiring constant attention from the linemen to maintain optimal tension. It was during this intense period of construction in the late summer of 1861 that the political climate back east erupted into open warfare. The American Civil War had begun. This catastrophic event immediately placed the transcontinental telegraph under an immense new burden of national significance. The project, already vital for commerce, now became the crucial communications artery for the Union government. President Lincoln and his military commanders desperately needed real-time communication with the West Coast, both to secure the loyalty of California and its gold reserves, and to coordinate military movements in the territories. The necessity of the line was no longer about profit or convenience. It was about the survival of the nation. This urgency infused the already dedicated crews with a new sense of purpose. They were not just laborers. They were, in their own silent way, soldiers of communication, their work just as vital to the war effort as the men marching in Virginia. The conflict also led to an immediate, dramatic acceleration of the work. Hiram Sibley, the visionary who orchestrated the entire scheme, recognized the historical moment. He pushed his division leaders, Creighton in the east and James Gamble in the west, to move faster than humanly possible. The bonus for finishing the line was significant, but the reward of connecting a nation during ute darkest hour was immeasurable. The crews were now moving into the ancestral lands of the Ute, Shoshone, and Paiute tribes, many of whom were growing increasingly wary of the relentless intrusion. The poles and the wire were seen as instruments of permanent settlement and were, in some instances, targeted. This necessitated the recruitment of armed guards, increasing the danger and the cost of the operation. The crews were building, but they were also defending their creation against both nature and human resistance, a challenge that demanded constant vigilance and adaptability. As the two halves of the line drew closer to their planned meeting spot in Salt Lake City, the tension was electric, not just because of the current they hoped to carry, but because of the immense historical weight resting on their shoulders. Salt Lake City, the isolated capital of the Mormon settlers, was perfectly positioned geographically, a major stopping point on the stagecoach and pony express routes, and thus a logical choice for a major repeater station. The leader of the Mormon community, Brigham Young, played a shrewd and vital role. Recognizing the immense benefit of being the central nexus of the new transcontinental communication system, he threw the resources of his community into assisting the crews, providing labor, supplies, and temporary shelter. This local support was indispensable, particularly for the Western crew emerging exhausted from the desert. The cooperation of the Mormons in Utah Territory proved to be the linchpin that held the final stages of the project together, transforming a challenge of geography into a triumph of organized human effort. The whisper of the telegraph was about to break the unbearable silence, connecting the war-torn East with the wealth and potential of the far West, just as the nation desperately needed to hear its own voice again. The final, exhilarating push was underway, with men laboring around the clock, knowing that the very next mile might bring the two lines together, making history with a simple splice of iron wire. The final days of the race to complete the transcontinental telegraph were not marked by speed, but by an almost painful sense of anticipation. The vast, silent plain that had separated east from west for centuries was now a mere handful of miles wide. Edward Creighton's men, the Eastern builders, had pushed their way across the desolate country of what would become Wyoming and into the mountainous terrain leading toward Utah, their journey's end. From the west, James Gamble's crews, hardened by the searing heat of the Great Basin, were traversing the final high-altitude passes. They were all converging on Salt Lake City, the chosen intersection point, not just because of its ideal geographical position, but because of the organizational stability provided by the Mormon community under Brigham Young. Young understood the power of being the nexus of communication, and his support, in the form of labor, food, and crucial local knowledge, was the vital oil in the machine that allowed the final stages to be executed flawlessly. The two crews were now so close that their scouts occasionally met, exchanging news and a sense of mutual triumph. The actual meeting point was eventually decided to be at the offices of the Deseret Telegraph Company in Salt Lake City, a symbolic choice that immediately integrated the new line into the local infrastructure. The atmosphere in the city was electric. Citizens who had endured a month-long delay for news from the outside world gathered daily near the central office, watching the final preparations. This was not the completion of a railway, signalled by the dramatic golden spike of 1869, but the connection of two separate coiled strands of iron wire. The act itself was deceptively simple, lacking the visual grandeur of a railroad ceremony, yet its meaning was infinitely more profound. It was the moment that thought became instantaneous. On the afternoon of October 24, 1861, the historical moment arrived. A small crowd, a mix of curious citizens, grim-faced soldiers, and the weary, dusty linemen, stood in the central office. The last stretch of wire had been carefully pulled across the final poles and threaded into the telegraph instrument. A sleek, humming piece of machinery connected to a small battery. Edward Creighton himself was present, his face etched with the exhaustion of overseeing the entire project, yet alight with quiet pride. The final connection was made with a simple splice, joining the eastern wire from Omaha and the western wire from Carson City. With that physical connection, the invisible bridge was complete, and the current was sent coursing through the thousands of miles of iron wire, a circuit stretching from coast to coast. The silence that followed was broken by the rhythmic, steady clicking of the telegraph sounder. The first message was transmitted by Stephen J. Field, Chief Justice of California, and was addressed to President Abraham Lincoln. It was a formal, patriotic, and deeply emotional message, affirming the loyalty of the Pacific Coast to the Union and offering California's rich gold reserves and full support to the war effort. This message, traveling 2,000 miles in mere minutes, was the first true testament to the telegraph's power. Before that moment, President Lincoln had been in virtual isolation from California, dependent on dated letters and news. Now, an entire new, loyal nation, vital to the Union's financial stability, was suddenly brought into his immediate counsel. Almost immediately, a cascade of other messages followed. Brigham Young sent a message to the East, offering congratulations and assuring the government that the newly connected Utah Territory was committed to maintaining the line and promoting peace. The mayor of San Francisco sent greetings to the mayor of New York City, and newspapers began to exchange greetings across the wire, celebrating the end of the communications chasm. These first messages were not about commerce, but about unity, sovereignty, and shared identity. The sheer speed of the exchange made an impression that is nearly impossible for us to comprehend today. For decades, news had moved at the speed of a horse or a sailing ship. Now, it moved at the speed of light. The continent, once an insurmountable barrier, was now woven together by a single, invisible thread of electrical impulse. The greatest, most dramatic immediate consequence of this connection was the silencing of the Pony Express. The very next day, October 25th, 1861, the company, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, sent out a simple, stark telegram along the new line, announcing the closure of the service. The last Pony Express ride, carrying a message from Fort Kearny, Nebraska, arrived in California just hours before the telegraph opened. The Pony Express, a romantic, daring, and physically demanding endeavor, had been rendered instantly obsolete. It was a poignant moment, symbolizing the swift, brutal nature of technological progress. The sound of the galloping horse, the symbol of frontier speed, was replaced by the silent, steady hum of the wire. A mere 18 months after its courageous launch, the Pony Express ceased to exist, a victim of the very speed and efficiency it had sought to provide. The men who had ridden the routes, the famous, often teenage riders who risked their lives daily, were now out of a job, their legendary bravery eclipsed by the simple fact of electricity. For President Lincoln, the telegraph was nothing short of a miracle tool. The line immediately became an extension of the Union military's command structure. Before, weeks passed between a Western commander's decision and the President's receipt of the news. Now, vital intelligence on Native American activity, troop movements in the territories, and the flow of gold from California could be delivered in real time. Historians agree that the transcontinental telegraph was a critical, if unsung, factor in the Union victory, allowing Lincoln to maintain control over the volatile border states and the vast western territories, ensuring they remained politically and financially aligned with the North throughout the long and bloody conflict. The line was thus an invisible weapon in the Union arsenal, linking the front lines of the war to the resources of the Pacific. The immediate economic impact was equally transformative. Stock market prices, which had lagged weeks behind across the country, were now synchronized. This ended the rampant speculation that had plagued Western business, where men could profit simply by knowing yesterday's prices in New York. The ability to instantly transact and verify information stabilized markets and catalyzed investment in the West. San Francisco was no longer a far-flung outpost, but an immediate partner in global commerce. This newly synchronized economic heartbeat began to drive the rapid expansion of Western infrastructure, setting the stage for the next great logistical challenge, the construction of the transcontinental railroad. The telegraph, in essence, was the nervous system that had to be in place before the skeletal system of the railroad could be reliably built. For the hundreds of weary men who had laid the line, the diggers, the setters, and the linemen, the completion brought a deep sense of shared accomplishment. Their names are largely lost to history, but their combined effort resulted in an achievement more durable and impactful than any gold strike or heroic ride. They had endured blistering deserts, freezing mountain nights, the constant threat of injury, and the sheer monotony of the labor. Their triumph was not just over distance, but over the pessimism of their era, which had declared the project logistically impossible. As the first official telegrams hummed along the newly laid wire, the men had done their part. The age of physical struggle had given way to the age of silent electrical transmission. The sound of their tools was quieted, replaced by the faint, steady click-clack of the receiver, announcing that a vast, divided land was now, truly and forever, one. Let that soothing, distant clicking sound be the metronome of your own deepening calm, knowing that the great work of the day is done and the long-distance connection is secure. The celebratory clicking of the telegraph sounder in October 1861 marked the end of the construction phase, but it signaled the immediate beginning of an even more subtle and relentless challenge, the maintenance phase. The transcontinental telegraph, stretching nearly 2,000 miles, was a continuous, delicate technological artery laid across a wild, unyielding landscape. The forces that sought to break this connection were not organized armies, but the quiet, eternal persistence of nature and the understandable resistance of those whose lives the line fundamentally changed. The initial builders had achieved the impossible. Now, a small, dedicated army of linemen and operators had to achieve the improbable task of keeping the line alive, day and night, through every season. The line's first great enemy was the weather. The plains and mountains subjected the iron wire to extremes that no existing telegraph system had ever faced. In the summer, the blistering desert sun caused the wire to expand and sag, sometimes drooping low enough to snag passing stagecoaches or livestock. In the winter, the expansion was reversed. The extreme cold of the high-altitude passes caused the wire to contract sharply, becoming incredibly taut, making it prone to snapping under the slightest additional stress, such as heavy icing or a strong gust of wind. Blizzards in the Rockies could bury miles of line under deep snowdrifts, crushing the poles and silencing the entire circuit for days until men on snowshoes could locate the break. And, of course, the line was a massive, continuous conductor of electricity, making it a perfect target for the dramatic lightning storms that sweep the high plains. A single, powerful strike could vaporize the iron wire for yards, destroy the delicate glass insulators, or even set fire to the wooden poles. Beyond the immediate fury of the weather, there were the less dramatic yet pervasive natural forces. Animals often contributed to the breaks. Herds of buffalo, then still roaming in vast dark masses, treated the poles as ideal scratching posts, rubbing against them with such force that they could loosen the pole's foundation or even snap it at the base. Curious bears would sometimes climb the poles, only to tangle with the wires. Even flocks of heavy birds landing en masse could apply enough momentary stress to a poorly tensioned section of wire to cause it to snap. The linemen quickly learned that the wilderness was not merely an empty space to cross. It was a dynamic, living system that was constantly testing the strength and resilience of the new intruder. The most difficult challenge, however, was posed by the human element, specifically the resistance from various Native American tribes. Many plains and basin tribes regarded the telegraph poles as a profound violation of sacred space. The poles stood sentinel over their ancestral hunting grounds, and the taut, humming wire was seen as an ominous sign, a literal line drawn across the path of the buffalo and a symbol of the accelerating encroachment of the white settlers. While some tribes maintained a cautious neutrality, others saw the line as a legitimate target in their escalating conflict with the United States Army and the influx of pioneers. Breaking the wire became a form of resistance, a way to sever the connection between the soldiers and the distant seat of power. Telegraph poles were often chopped down, the iron wire cut and stolen. The wire itself was prized by some warriors, who used the heavy, pliable metal to fashion intricate bracelets, tools, and arrow points. In a strange, unintended consequence, the very object designed to bring peace and order became a consistent point of friction and warfare. The periods of heaviest conflict often coincided with the most widespread disruptions to the telegraph service. Military communications, essential for coordinating defense and supply, would suddenly go dark, plunging the remote military outposts back into the agonizing silence the telegraph was built to overcome. This necessitated a continuous small-scale war of repair and sabotage, with the linemen often working under armed guard, or sometimes entirely alone and at great risk. The heroes of this ongoing effort were the telegraph maintenance riders, or line riders. These men had one of the loneliest and most dangerous jobs in the West. They were typically stationed at the small, isolated repeater stations or scattered military outposts. Their task was to ride a specific section of the line, often up to 100 miles in length, to inspect it for damage. They carried simple tools, a spool of spare wire, a few insulators, and a rifle for defense. When the line went down, the telegrapher in the nearest station would use his instrument to determine the approximate location of the break by measuring the resistance, a crude but effective form of early diagnostics. The line rider would then saddle up and ride out into the vast emptiness, following the faint line of poles until he located the damage. The job was characterized by endless isolation. Day after day, the rider followed the faint path, listening for the distinctive hum of the functional wire or scanning for the telltale snap of a broken pole. Repairing a break required resourcefulness, often involving scaling a high pole alone, splicing the heavy iron wire with numb fingers in a freezing wind, or hauling a replacement pole from miles away. This was a life of quiet perseverance, where the success of the entire continental communication system rested on the fortitude of a single man in the wilderness. The line rider, silent and solitary, was the true guardian of the instantaneous age, the human counterpart to the relentless, silent current flowing through the wire. Crucial to the entire system were the repeater stations, small wooden buildings often located near military forts or remote stagecoach stops. The signal traveling through the iron wire would grow weak after a few hundred miles due to electrical resistance. The repeater stations were necessary to receive the faint pulse, regenerate it, and send it on to the next station. These stations were staffed by the telegraphers, the men who spoke the language of the Morse code. Their existence was often as isolated as the line riders. They lived within the constant, hypnotic click-clack of the sounder, their whole world reduced to the dots and dashes arriving from 2,000 miles away. They were the ears and the voice of the continent, the human switchboard that ensured the whisper from Washington reached San Francisco, or the news of a gold strike flew eastward. This quiet, repetitive, technical work was the bedrock of the entire system, allowing the human voice to conquer the great distances the physical body could not. The sound of the sounder, a steady, rhythmic pattern of coded meaning, was the new pulse of the American West, a constant, low-level vibration of civilization reaching across the silent plains. With the transcontinental telegraph now functioning, despite the endless, quiet battles fought by the line riders in the wilderness, the focus shifted from the physical wire to the invisible current it carried. This current spoke a language all its own, Morse code, a brilliant system of dots and dashes, short and long electrical pulses that represented letters and numbers. Learning the code was an intense discipline, demanding not just memorization, but a unique auditory and tactile skill. Telegraphers trained their ears to recognize the precise cadence of the clicking sounder, translating the rhythmic patterns instantly into language. They often became so attuned to the code that they could recognize the fist or unique sending style of distant operators they had never met, much like recognizing a voice over a long-distance call today. This exclusive language bound together the small, scattered community of telegraphers into a kind of electronic priesthood, the only people who truly heard the continuous, rapid pulse of the continent's news. This newfound speed of information fundamentally transformed journalism and the way Americans consumed news. Before 1861, news traveled at the speed of the stagecoach, often weeks behind events. Newspapers printed reports that were already ancient history by the time they arrived. The telegraph changed this overnight, creating the concept of breaking news. A consortium of newspapers, realizing they could share the immense cost of transmitting long dispatches across the continent, formalized their cooperation into the Associated Press. Instead of waiting for the stage, reporters now clustered at telegraph offices, often bribing operators for early access to incoming war reports or market updates. News became fresh, urgent, and highly valued. The language of journalism became shorter, punchier, and more direct, a necessity born from the high cost of sending messages where every word was paid for. The expansive, flowery prose of the past gave way to the sharp, economical style we recognize today, driven by the very nature of the electrical pulse. Nowhere was the impact of instantaneous communication more profound than in Washington, D.C., within the command structure of the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln recognized the strategic value of the telegraph with an insight unmatched by his contemporaries. He essentially relocated his primary operational base from the White House to the small, unimposing War Department telegraph office. Here, tucked away in the constant, rhythmic clicking and chattering of the instruments, Lincoln found his center of power. He would spend hours in the office, often late into the night, reading incoming field reports directly from generals on the battlefields of Virginia and Pennsylvania. He could issue orders, receive confirmations, and demand clarification in real time, a revolutionary ability that allowed him to manage the war effort with a level of detail and responsiveness impossible for previous commanders-in-chief. The transcontinental line, linking him directly to the gold and political stability of California, was particularly vital. It eliminated the possibility of delayed communication, causing California to drift toward secession or neutrality. Every morning, Lincoln could receive a direct, authenticated report on gold shipments, Western troop movements, and diplomatic negotiations with Native American tribes, all crucial to the Union's ability to fund and prosecute the war. The telegraph, for Lincoln, was a powerful tool of centralized authority, shrinking the vast distances of the battlefield and the continent into a single room in the capital. The operators in that small office became some of the most trusted men in the Union, privy to the most sensitive secrets of the war, translating the fate of the nation from electrical pulses into written words. Beyond the political and military, the telegraph was the engine of the Western economic explosion. Instantaneous communication removed the crippling risk of time lag. Before the wire, a merchant in San Francisco, placing an order for goods from a supplier in New York, had to wait months for confirmation, introducing massive uncertainty. With the telegraph, transactions could be completed, confirmed, and financed within minutes. This reliable, rapid flow of information dramatically lowered the risk of investment, spurring massive financial growth in the West. It allowed the rapid development of mining, agriculture, and commerce by providing essential real-time access to the financial markets of the East. The entire economy of the United States began to beat with a single, synchronized pulse. Crucially, the telegraph was the silent precursor to the next great continental project, the Transcontinental Railroad. The massive effort to lay tracks across the same rugged territories was immensely complicated. The two railroad companies, Union Pacific Building West and Central Pacific Building East, needed constant, reliable communication to coordinate their material shipments, financial flows, land grants, and labor forces. The railroad itself would have been logistically impossible without the telegraph line laid alongside the tracks. The telegraph poles became the constant companions of the rails, a visible symbol that the informational infrastructure had to be in place before the physical infrastructure could succeed. The telegraph was the eyes, ears, and brain of the railroad effort, ensuring that the thousands of tons of iron rails, spikes, and ties reached the railhead exactly when and where they were needed. However, this instantaneous age came at a cost: the loss of the romance of distance. Before the telegraph, distance provided a buffer, a space for rumors to grow and for news to soften. A letter written a month ago might arrive with a sense of nostalgic longing. Now, communication was immediate and often brutally direct. The time for reflection was gone, replaced by the demand for immediate reaction. The vastness of the West, once a place of myth and impenetrable mystery, was suddenly rendered small and accessible by the wire. The excitement of the gold rushes, the daring of the pioneers, and the sheer physical effort of crossing the continent were overshadowed by the prosaic yet potent fact that a financial report from a mountain pass could be read in London just minutes after it was generated. The telegraph had demystified the American landscape, trading the slow, poetic adventure of the journey for the sharp, efficient reality of instant connection. This subtle shift in perception marked the true beginning of the modern era, where distance ceased to be an obstacle and became, instead, merely a measure of how long a wire had to be. As the Civil War drew to a close and the physical challenge of building the transcontinental telegraph faded into legend, the ownership and operation of the line settled into a profound state of monopolistic stability. The architect of the successful connection, Hiram Sibley, was also the driving force behind the dramatic consolidation of telegraphic power across the entire nation. Under his relentless ambition, the Western Union Telegraph Company began systematically buying up smaller, independent lines. The Pacific Telegraph Company and the Overland Telegraph Company, the very entities that had raced to build the transcontinental link, were soon fully absorbed. By the late 1860s, Western Union controlled an astonishing amount of the nation's telegraph network, giving them near total dominion over the speed and price of American communication. This company became a titan of industry, a silent, powerful force that could move information, and therefore markets and political influence at will. The iron wire that had once been a symbol of national unity now became a symbol of corporate centralization. This centralization, however, brought a measure of reliability to the vast, untamed line. Western Union established rigid standards for maintenance and operation. The isolated repeater stations became small, self-sufficient outposts of corporate culture in the wilderness. The telegraphers stationed there were often eccentrics, fiercely independent, yet bound by the code and the constant pulse of the network. Their lives were defined by isolation and rhythm. They kept meticulous logs, monitored the wire for any static or drop-in current that might signal a break, and lived within the sound of the sounder. They developed a unique, deep sense of place, yet their minds were always connected to New York and San Francisco. They communicated with each other personally, using the official wire for casual chatter, sharing jokes, discussing the weather, and even conducting long-distance courtships in the silent language of the dots and dashes. This subculture of the code provided a vital human element to the cold, hard logic of the machine, creating an invisible web of fellowship across the immense continent. Despite the corporate stability, the physical line remained in a state of perpetual fragility. The iron wire, exposed to years of extreme weather, began to rust and weaken. The wooden poles were targeted by rot, insects, and prairie fires. The maintenance crews were constantly battling nature's slow decay. Even as the line aged, its importance was only magnified by the progress of the transcontinental railroad. The tracks often ran right alongside the telegraph line, creating a symbiotic relationship where the train provided transportation for repair crews and supplies, and the telegraph provided the indispensable communication that prevented accidents and coordinated the movement of rail traffic. The wire and the rail were inseparable partners in the final conquest of the American West. The continued presence and expansion of the wire also served as a focal point for continued resistance from Native American tribes, especially during the Indian Wars of the late 1860s and 1870s. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Apache, the poles remained a visible affront to their sovereignty and a tangible target for their hostility toward the encroaching settlers and the military. The lines were routinely cut, not out of technological curiosity, but as a deliberate act of warfare, a way to blind and deafen the U.S. Army. The linemen, therefore, often worked under military escort, transforming the act of routine repair into a dangerous military operation. The simple, silent wire continued to be a literal line of conflict, drawing a harsh division between the traditional ways of life and the relentless advance of the industrialized nation. A fascinating episode that highlighted the global significance of the existing line was the near realization of a massive parallel project, the Russian-American telegraph. Conceived as an effort to connect America to Europe via Asia, the plan involved building a monumental telegraph line that would run through British Columbia, cross the Bering Strait into Siberia, and then span the vast Russian continent to link up with the European system. This immense project, backed by Western Union itself and led by a massive expeditionary force, began construction in the mid-1860s. Crews faced unbelievable hardship in the frozen, uncharted territories of Alaska and Siberia, battling permafrost, immense distances, and extreme cold. However, as the Russian-American crews struggled valiantly through the Alaskan wilderness, another event rendered their monumental effort instantly irrelevant: the successful laying of a permanent, functional transatlantic cable under the ocean in 1866. Led by the indefatigable Cyrus Field, the deep-sea cable finally achieved the direct, rapid link between the Old World and the New. The news flashed across the existing transcontinental telegraph, silencing the distant work camps in the far north. The Russian-American line, a project nearly as epic as the one across the American West, was abandoned almost overnight. Tens of millions of dollars and years of human effort were rendered obsolete by a technology that bypassed land altogether. This sudden, quiet cancellation served as a stark, dramatic lesson in the unforgiving speed of technological progress. The success of the American transcontinental line had been a crucial precursor, proving that such a vast electrical network was possible, but even it could not stop the advance of the next great innovation. The existing transcontinental telegraph, while no longer the world's only continental link, continued its vital, quiet work. It had achieved its primary goal: to bind a nation together during its moment of greatest peril and to catalyze the development of the West. Its triumph was that it became ordinary, blending into the landscape alongside the railroad tracks and stagecoach roads. The humming iron wire became so integral to the American experience that its revolutionary nature was often forgotten. It stood as a silent, physical reminder that the true conquest of the West was not accomplished solely by soldiers or settlers, but by the relentless, invisible current that allowed a thought in Washington to resonate instantly and clearly in the deepest reaches of California. Its legacy was the end of separation, allowing the collective consciousness of a new nation to finally move at the speed of light. Let the image of those isolated, dedicated operators sitting at their desks, listening to the rhythmic, comforting click of the sounder, guide you deeper into your rest. With the relentless efficiency of Western Union, the transcontinental telegraph gradually transitioned from a spectacular feat of engineering into an expected utility, a silent, dependable infrastructure that simply worked. This transition from novelty to necessity is often where the true, profound impact of a technology lies, allowing it to subtly yet fundamentally reshape society. The telegraph was no longer just a way to send news. It became the central nervous system for law, order, and social coordination across the vast American expanse. The speed of the wire was now turned against the very lawlessness that the slow, wide-open frontier had nurtured. The ability to instantly transmit detailed descriptions and warnings revolutionized law enforcement. Before 1861, an outlaw robbing a bank or stagecoach had a significant head start. By the time news of the crime traveled by horseback or coach, the criminal could be hundreds of miles away, effectively dissolving into the anonymity of the West. The telegraph erased this advantage. The moment a robbery was discovered, a flash telegram could be sent out to every major city, railway station, and military outpost along the line. Suddenly, the entire continent became a net, and the criminal's head start was reduced to minutes. Famous outlaws and gangs, including those like the James Younger gang, found their movements constrained by the knowledge that their every action could be instantly reported and their descriptions circulated. The telegraph was the silent, invisible partner of the sheriff, bringing the long reach of organized justice to the remotest corners of the territory, effectively shrinking the vastness that had protected criminals for generations. This instantaneous sharing of information did more than just catch criminals. It began to forge a shared national consciousness. Before the telegraph, a major event in New York might not be fully grasped in California for a month, allowing local interpretations and biases to dominate. With the wire, Americans, regardless of their physical location, began to experience national events, elections, disasters, and triumphs simultaneously. They read the same news headlines, often word for word at the same time. This creation of a common mental space was revolutionary. It helped unify a deeply fractured nation after the Civil War, fostering a sense of shared identity and immediate participation in the national narrative. The country started to think, react, and mourn as one unit, a profound psychological transformation underpinned by the clicking sounder. The men and women who operated this invisible web, the telegraphers, held extraordinary quiet power. They were the gatekeepers and the scribes of the instantaneous age. In isolated repeater stations, the operator was often the only link to the outside world, making them indispensable. During fires, floods, or major railway accidents, the telegrapher would often stay at his post, sending warnings and casualty reports until the very last moment, sometimes sacrificing his own safety. Their responsibility was immense, translating the abstract electrical pulse into human language, ensuring the fidelity of every dot and dash, and managing the constant flow of traffic, from a general's urgent orders to a mother's simple message of comfort. They were the quiet heroes, their lives defined by the constant presence of profound, continental information passing through their fingertips. As the years passed, the original iron wire of the transcontinental telegraph began to face inevitable obsolescence, not just from age, but from technological refinement. The line had been a triumph of Iron Age ingenuity, but the future belonged to copper. Copper wire offered far less electrical resistance than iron, allowing signals to travel farther and faster, requiring fewer repeater stations. As Western Union upgraded its infrastructure, sections of the original iron line were slowly replaced, repurposed, or simply abandoned. This gradual change represented the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The era of the hardy frontier-built system giving way to a more sophisticated, technologically optimized network. The original poles and wires, monuments to the tenacity of the first builders, faded into the landscape, consumed by rust, fire, and time. A silent acknowledgement that all monumental feats of infrastructure must eventually yield to the relentless march of efficiency. Among the millions of messages that passed over the wire, some captured the true range of human experience that the line made possible. There were urgent messages regarding geological discoveries and the finding of vast new ore deposits, which instantly triggered investment booms and mass migrations. There were long, carefully coded dispatches between scientists and inventors, collaborating on the next generation of electrical and mechanical marvels. And there were the deeply personal, often terse messages of life and death, announcements of births, declarations of love, and grim news of loss. In a few dozen words, the entirety of a human crisis or a great joy was condensed, stripped bare by the necessity of cost and speed, yet gaining an emotional punch from its sheer instantaneous arrival. These fragments of human life, travelling at the speed of light across mountains and deserts, formed the true, enduring legacy of the line. The telegraph had woven a physical network across the land, but its ultimate achievement was weaving a shared, continuous fabric of American experience. Let that quiet hum of the fading iron wire be a gentle sound now. Think of the solitary operator sitting patiently, listening to the rhythmic clicking of the sounder, the steady pulse of a connected world. That quiet persistence, that unseen effort, allowed a continent to speak to itself. Now, as the line rests, so too should you, letting the gentle, fading echo of the dots and dashes guide you toward a deeper, peaceful sleep. The success of the transcontinental telegraph, the great iron thread that wove the American continent together, ultimately led to its own supersession. Technology, a force that had once vanquished the Pony Express, never rests. By the turn of the 20th century, the era of the clicking sounder and the solitary telegrapher began a long, graceful decline, overshadowed by the arrival of the telephone and the radio. The telephone, developed by Alexander Graham Bell, allowed for the transmission of the human voice itself, eliminating the need for the tedious process of coding and decoding messages. The voice, instantaneous and emotionally rich, offered a level of intimacy and immediacy that the dots and dashes simply could not match. Simultaneously, the development of wireless radio telegraphy and then broadcasting offered communication that bypassed the physical vulnerability of the wire altogether, reaching across oceans and over mountains without a single pole. Despite the rise of these newer, flashier technologies, the transcontinental telegraph line, now largely upgraded to copper and buried underground in crucial areas, did not vanish overnight. It remained a vital backbone for decades, especially for commercial traffic, railway coordination, and press services, which relied on the efficiency of codified messages. The infrastructure laid by Creighton and Gamble provided the essential right-of-way and the organizational structure that the subsequent telephone and microwave networks would utilize. The original poles and wires were eventually removed, replaced, or simply succumbed to the weather. But the route and the concept of instantaneous communication across that 2,000-mile stretch had become permanent. The engineers of the transcontinental telegraph had not just built a line, they had permanently re-engineered the perception of American space. Today, if you travel across the vast, quiet landscapes of Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah, the physical remnants of this historical monument are subtle, demanding a quiet kind of attention to find. You may occasionally stumble upon a stretch of unusually placed old cedar poles, weathered and grey, standing like silent sentinels that once held the iron thread of a nation's conversation. These ghost poles often follow the line of the older stagecoach routes or the earliest railway beds. In small, forgotten towns along the original route, you might find a preserved repeater station, now a quiet museum, its telegraph instrument displayed under glass, its sounder forever silenced. These are the silent memorials to the greatest communications achievement of the 19th century, a subtle echo of the great race and the constant struggle of the line riders. The story of the telegraph now lives not in the sound of its clicking, but in the peaceful silence that has returned to the vast plains. The lasting legacy of the transcontinental telegraph is not found in the preserved artifacts or the faded routes, but in the philosophical shift it initiated. Before 1861, time and space were inextricably linked. To cover a physical distance of 2,000 miles, a certain long period of time was strictly required. The telegraph severed this ancient, fundamental bond. It proved that information could travel faster than man, faster than the horse, and almost instantaneously. This realization was a profound moment in human history, forever altering the way people scheduled their lives, conducted their commerce, and conceived of their shared national reality. It taught America that the entire continent could exist within a single, real-time moment, setting the stage for all subsequent advancements that continue to shrink our world today. The speed of light became the new benchmark for human connection, replacing the patient, arduous speed of the human journey. As we bring this remarkable true story to a close, allow your mind to settle on the quiet image of that single iron wire, taut and humming, stretching across the dark, silent continent under the vast, indifferent sky of 1861. Consider the immense physical effort, the dedication of the thousands of men who dug the holes, raised the poles, and spliced the wire, and the lonely, persistent vigil of the operators who translated the electrical pulse into meaning. Their labor, quiet and unrelenting, broke the silence of the American frontier forever, transforming a collection of distant territories into one connected nation. Now, that great historical tension has been released. The wires are silent, the work is done, and the long journey of the story is complete. There are no more urgent messages to send, no more distant signals to receive. Just the gentle, deep silence of the night, the peaceful stillness that remains after all the grand human endeavor has passed. Let the rhythm of the history fade into the quiet comfort of the present moment. Allow the sense of vast distance and the speed of light to dissolve, leaving only the calm certainty of rest. All the threads of the day are secured, the lines are down, and the world is finally still. Drift now with the final gentle hush and surrender to the deep, unbroken quiet of the night.